Soon, security began to round up the presumably important workers within the building so they could try and safely escort everyone out of the situation. Many of the Miat had unsure expressions on their face, with their narrow lips pressed tightly together and their ears folded backwards or hanging down limply. It seemed that a good number of them had not been prepared for such an incident to occur at their workplace. The feline security squad did their best to provide a reassuring presence. However, it seemed that there was little to be done to ease the seemingly fairly pampered workers' minds, as many of them pulled out all kinds of personal assistance, presumably in order to call family, loved ones, or whatever kind of emergency contacts they had saved for themselves. Of course, James didn't understand anything they were saying into the microphones of their devices. However, the frightened looks on their faces and the shakiness of their voices, as they were urged to huddle together by the armed personnel, uncomfortably reminded him of those he had seen and heard of the workers of the GCS's Center for Gravity Control, back when they had to deal with a very similar situation befalling them. One that he, admittedly, had played no small part in. Flashes of eyes staring back at him, so ridden by fears that they quivered as they tried their best to keep their focus and avoiding it to even blink so they wouldn't lose sight of him for even a fraction of a second, played out before his inner eye. They were troubling him a lot more than the presumed threat to his own safety the unrest on the station possibly caused. In his life, he had been through both much more dangerous and much worse over all situations more than just a few times. Therefore, especially surrounded by his old team, whom he knew he could trust blindly, he managed to remain relatively calm and collected. Yet the grim reminders of his own failure surrounding him on all sides made many cold shivers chase each other down his spine, as every hair on his body began to stand up. "It's a good thing communications are even still up," Athena commented, as she watched the insecure workers being ushered along by the armed, stoic guards. "Do you think we're dealing with that level of attack here?" James inquired with a sideways glance at the tall woman, who appeared to be already mentally preparing for the things ahead with her weapon drawn. The space-safe assault weapon lay perfectly still in her gloved, slender hands, as her finger hovered gently around the matte material of the trigger guard. On a station as big as this one, using space-safe weapons with low penetrant power was probably hardly necessary. However, in the end, nobody wanted to be the one responsible for accidentally decompressing a populated structure. This, however, also meant that, theoretically, it could be a lot harder to get past an enemy's armor, should it be advanced enough. "If we're lucky, it's just another bout of protests," Andrich announced firmly to everyone, cutting through the semi-personal conversation and instead making it an official discussion. "But, just in case, let's stay prepared for everything." Everyone nodded back at him. The Major then began to make sure everyone was completely aware of their assigned roles in an emergency like this. While they were planning to cooperate with the local forces to make everything go as smoothly as possible, they were still enact their own defensive plan as well. As James was the thing being guarded, he and Sheeta basically had the roles of stand back and let yourself be protected. Of course, should it come to that, the two of them had the skills to be a lot more hands-on in their own protection, and they were both armed and ready to do so if bad came to worse. However, hopefully, that wouldn't be necessary. Meanwhile, the commissioned officers of James's old team each had one of the lower-ranking soldiers making up the rest of their security assigned to them. The lieutenants were to both take point in their advances, while the captain and the major stood back and kept overwatch of the situation. As they organised and also made sure to not get in the way of any of the pre-planned local procedures going on all around them, James leaned over to Sheeta for a moment. For what it was worth, she seemed to be about as calm about the situation as he was. She was alert, but not scared, and that much reflected in her posture. She was standing up straight, ears erect at a wide angle to take in as much information as possible, with her tail locked into constant, smooth movement. Her left arm was hanging relaxedly at her side, while her right hand hovered around the sidearm she was carrying at her hip, and her face bore a firm and reserved expression that didn't give away many, if any, of her emotions on the matter. "Anything interesting we're missing?" James asked. And the way that the amplifiers in his breath filter warped his voice whenever he spoke never stood out to him quite as much as it did in that moment, because the mechanical sound of it morphed his attempt at a soothingly calming yet casual tone into something that sounded like an automated answering machine at a call center. For a second, that annoyed him so much that he seriously considered taking the mask off in order to talk more freely, but he quickly abandoned the thought. Being made for military use, the filter provided a good amount of protection for his head, and giving that up for a slight bit of comfort was likely an unwise decision. Shida also didn't appear to be all too bothered by his warped and therefore seemingly unsympathetic tone, most likely since that was exactly how she had heard him sound for a long while now, whenever he was wearing the mask out in public. All things considered, it was of course unlikely that he even needed to ask that question. After all, if anything important were to come up, it was almost certain that Shida would inform everyone about it immediately of her own volition, and without needing to be prompted to do so. However, with all the talking and muttering happening in strange languages all around him, it would have been a lie if James claimed that he wouldn't have already felt a lot better just understanding anything of what was being said, even if it was mundane. Maybe Shida could read that much from his behaviour, or maybe she, too, felt the need to ease her mind ever so slightly, and thought that talking to him might provide such a relief. Either way, she replied, "A lot of kids and housekeepers being told to stay home and keep all doors locked, although some don't seem to be at home right now." James swallowed heavily hearing that information. Even in a place like this, the thought of kids getting involved somewhat got to him. If this really was another riot in the making, he hoped the protesters were aware enough to know that the one group you could certainly not make responsible for any of the stuff that was going on was definitely children. Yet he knew in his gut what mob mentality could do to people, and he instinctively felt that it was better if he didn't think too much about it right now. At least this explained many of the worried faces all around. He then noticed that Shida had started to stare somewhat past him, with a judging look in her eyes, and he turned his head slightly in order to follow her gaze. Not too far off from the group, but still clearly enjoying some special treatment from the local security, stood Kwafrem and Loijavar, seemingly whispering so quietly to each other that not even Amiet's fine hearing could pick up what they were saying from this distance, while they both stood slightly hunched over a personal assistant, attached to Loijavar's arm, most likely gathering some information about whatever was happening on the station, from whatever sources they might have had at their disposal. "Much more interested in what those two have to discuss there, though," Shida added onto her previous statement, while her yellow eyes remained fixed on the two men. James couldn't say that he disagreed, especially since information was pretty vital for his team to formulate a plan of action right now. However, it seemed that, at that moment, the local security forces had finished their preparations, and they began to get things moving. Their presumed leader, a well-trained Miat whose face still seemed to look a bit too smooth and unburdened for their occupation, began to loudly address the huddled-together people. Shida immediately took it upon herself to translate what he was saying to them, repeating it in GU with only a slight delay after his words. "Everyone listen up. As you all know by now, there are unrest developing on the station. So far, they seem to be relatively contained in different areas. However, we believe it would be better to evacuate the building before they can spread out. According to our information, there still is a secure corridor behind the building's back exit. We will be using that to transport you all to a more secure location. Since we can't guarantee that no stragglers find their way there while we are on the move, please be sure to stay within the safe perimeter provided by our security at all times. Stay calm, move swiftly, and listen to any orders given by our personnel. If we do make contact with hostiles, don't panic. Simply follow the provided instructions and remove yourself from the dangerous area as swiftly as possible, while we deal with the problem. The situation will soon be handled by reinforcements of the military, so don't worry too much. We're merely transporting you as a precautionary measure." The workers responded in some mumbles and half-sentences that Shida didn't bother translating. From the sound of it, it seemed like some of them may not have been all too happy with those conditions and explanations, but they weren't going to pass up on protection just to voice their displeasure. However, for some of the people present, voicing their displeasure was a vital part of their occupation. "What and where exactly is this supposed safer location?" Andres loudly asked over the general mumble coming from the Miat workers in a demanding tone, causing quite the number of heads to turn in his direction as he stood tall, firmly awaiting an answer that should better be satisfying. Shida, ever dutiful, immediately translated the question, just in case the feline's abilities in speaking or understanding GU were severely lacking. However, that much appeared to not be necessary, as a familiar voice quickly took over answering that question for the addressed men. "It's a secure building, a bunker if you will, just a few blocks down from here," Loinjavar calmly informed the Major, having lifted his gaze from his assistant and hidden it along with his hands behind his back, standing tall in a respectful position. "It is specifically designed for residents to take shelter in situations much like this one. I can point it out on a map of the station for you, if you wish." "And how can we be sure the location is secure?" Andres continued his questioning directly, yet respectfully, although James had a feeling that he was already weighing their chances with just breaking loose from this evacuation plan and trying to make their way out by themselves instead. HFY nodded seemingly understandingly at the question, his face and haze remaining soft and approachable as he replied, "The building is staffed at all times with highly trained guards to ensure its availability at a moment's notice. It also runs on an isolated system from the rest of the station, meaning any attacks on infrastructure will leave it unfazed. It is even able to sustain any inhabitants for multiple days in the event of a full decompression of the station. We are already in contact with the on-site staff, and they have confirmed that they are primed and ready to receive us." That sounded like a fairly typical bunker for a station. Not bad as a defensible position, but it would also leave them holed up and unable to move until the situation was resolved, should things further escalate. Then again, if it was made for situations like this, maybe there was some sort of secure exit as well. Wouldn't be too far-fetched of an idea. And while James had little doubt that they could individually make their way out of here and get all the way to the docks, depending on the demeanour of those causing the unrest, he wasn't so sure if they could do it without causing any casualties. As what was basically a diplomat, he felt like he should avoid that, if at all possible. Still, as Andrzej briefly turned to him, most likely to get some input from his side, he replied with, "Your call, Major." He wasn't going to pretend that Andrzej didn't have years more experience with things like these. James had no intention of throwing his weight around and thus potentially putting everyone he technically had command over in danger for no good reason. Andrzej nodded and looked over at Athena, who subtly shrugged in response. Andrzej nodded once more and turned back to the Miat, making the announcement earlier. "Lead the way then," he said, dropping some of his extremely straight posture in favour of a somewhat more relaxed stance. As announced, the armed Miat began to surround the workers as well as the troop of humans and ushered them towards the back exit of the building. And although HFY put considerable effort into remaining a relaxed and casual presence, despite the circumstances, his boss didn't quite do the same. HFY, while not exactly looking afraid in the slightest, seemed to be more than just minorly inconvenienced by this whole ordeal. His face was scrunched up, and the corners of his mouth hung down in a frown together with his cheeks. But besides that, there was something more. A feeling of grim foreboding seemed to be hiding behind his blue eyes, as they constantly stared to the ground without focusing on anything. Not enough to make him appear outright worried, not yet at least. But James knew that look on the man's face from Shida. Something was clearly gnawing at him. True to the feline's information, the part behind Carfwem's building appeared to still be clear of any of the ongoing unrest that was spreading across the station. Therefore their walk across the open area, despite the inherent intensity that came with being escorted by armed guards, was relatively calm for the time being. James saw this as an opportunity, and he moved his steps a bit sideways, just enough to divert his course slightly. Step by step, he came a bit closer to Carfwem with each one, until he was finally within comfortable earshot, after they had walked 10 measures or so. "If you have a clearer picture about what is happening, I'd be very thankful if you could share it with us," James announced, without leading into it with any niceties, his artificially enhanced voice cutting through the mostly still air like a warm knife through butter. "I consider any information that could help keep my staff even the tiniest bit safer to be vital." Carfwem, who had apparently been a bit lost in thought, snapped his gaze around towards James in slight surprise, as it seemingly took him a moment to fully process what the human had said. However, he quickly recomposed himself with a quick shake of his head, and he made a disgruntled clicking noise with his tongue. For a moment, James was certain that the man would just blow his concerns off and refuse to share anything with him. However, despite his rather unpleasant reaction, and although he bared his fangs all the while he talked, the pale man rather directly replied, "Some error in the system. Let in a gaggle of fools who aren't supposed to be here without notifying security. Now they're making trouble on the station." An error in the system? Well, surely Carfwem was no stranger to that at this point. And indeed, looking into his blue eyes, it seemed that he wasn't all too surprised about the possibility of this happening. Still, it seemed that there may have been a bit more to it. Something that he wasn't quite so willing to share. All of a sudden, James felt like the man was sizing him up with his sideways glare. "Any idea where the error lies?" he asked anyway, despite having his own theory about what the problem possibly was. And one he knew at a first-name basis at that. Although, would Veselon really start something like this despite knowing that he was on the station as well? Well, if they knew he was on the station. There was no guarantee for that, after all, although a feeling in his gut made him fairly certain that they most likely did. Qualfram shook his head, his wild white hair flying around slightly with emotion. "No idea," he said, and although he was a good liar, James could see right through it. Although maybe it was the other way around. Maybe it was James's certainty that the man was lying in the first place that made him think that he could see through a well-veiled lie, instead of just disregarding the truth. Then again, their very same bias made it hard to even consider that option as a possibility. All around them, their guards were keeping a tight lock on the situation. The movements of constant scanning and surveilling of the human teams was of course very familiar to James, as they took each new nook or cranny, side alley or ventilation shaft, as a possible angle of attack that needed to be cleared, and never let out of their sight while within a dangerous range. Each of them held a tight focus on such possible hostile areas, walking without taking their eyes off them, their buddy guarding them the whole time, until it was time to zero in on the next, which was when they communicated to the next two-person team behind them to take over, making each spot of interest move down the line of people until finally being left behind by the moving group. The Miat, on the other hand, handled the situation quite differently. Acting a lot more as a group of individuals than as an actual team, they spread out, sporadically checking on those same spots of interest the humans were focused on, while mostly trying to keep a wider view of the area. Meanwhile, their large ears were locked in constant movement, spinning like a radar dish while looking out of any stray noise that wasn't supposed to be there. Interestingly, despite being born from very different philosophies, the two strategies complemented each other quite well in this case, as each of the parties provided an additional layer of protection, covering exactly those areas that their individual strategies couldn't perfectly secure. Meanwhile, James wasn't sure if his own much less sensible layers were playing tricks on him. However, he felt like he could hear some signs of the unrest happening somewhere in the distance. The vague notion of yelling and shouting filled his consciousness, and he couldn't tell if it was real or just his brain's idea of the things he should probably hear in this situation. At least he didn't hear any shots or other explosions ring out through the heavy air of the station yet. Still, he felt his body tense up, almost anticipating for such a sound to occur any moment now. "Contact!" 2 years high and artificially amplified voice suddenly rang out, and as James turned his head, he could see her point her rifle in the direction of some approaching Miat that came from an adjacent crossroad. Despite their rather raggedy clothes when compared to the escorted workers of the Comaltopeno, it was of course hard to know if the group of 6 people really belonged to the presumably rioting groups, and weren't just unfortunate members of the janitorial staff finding themselves at the wrong place at the wrong time. However, the hard looks on their faces, with their brows lowered and their lips tightly pressed, as well as the makeshift staffs and or clubs they were carrying with them, didn't exactly paint a friendly picture. James clenched his teeth slightly. However, he still remained calm for the most part. Those people were horribly outmatched, and they hopefully knew that. The 3 Miat guards taking point in the escort had by now also lifted their weapons threateningly, and loudly shouted something at the approaching and presumably hostile group. The group unsurprisingly yelled something back, sounding not at all happy about what they were hearing. However, something strange seemed to be happening at the same time, as 2 more of the feline guards had separated from the rest of their troop and took a few steps back, now approaching the 4 frontmost humans, and concerningly stepping within their line of fire. Of course, James wasn't the only one that noticed, and Tuya and Admir already moved to tell them to get out of the damn way. However, before they had time for that, the hostile group suddenly began charging. Reacting synchronously, like a switch had been flipped, the human soldiers all moved to raise their weapons. However, the Miat guards reacted even quicker than that, already blocking any possible attempts to fire at their assailants. Immediately, James's mind was racing. What was happening? Were they colluding with each other? It certainly didn't seem like it with the way the hostiles were still running at the frontmost feline guards. Then again, for some reason, it seemed like the armed Miat had ever so slightly lowered their weapons, not appearing in a position to effectively neutralize their attacking opponents anymore. Still, as they didn't want to accidentally mow down their allies without a very good reason to do so, the humans stepped back slightly, forming a more defensive circle around their VIPs, completely ready to defend against a possible attack from both parties now engaged in combat, while only being able to watch the attacks on their supposed allies unfold. Indeed, they had nearly completely lowered their weapons the closer their presumed attackers had come, and when the first guard was finally reached by the first hostile, the barrel of his weapon was pointing near completely to the floor. The rugged-looking feline tried to attack the man with a wide swing of his makeshift bludgeon, a loud hiss escaping his lips, in some form of primal cry as he put most of his weight into the attack. Luckily, the much better trained soldier wasn't perturbed by the unbridled attack, and he quickly laid his attacker out, avoiding the swing by quickly stepping into the man's way, while simultaneously bringing up the butt of his rifle against his assailant's sternum in a hard but precise thrust. The hit was so fast that James only fully realised what had happened after the fact, and it was hard enough to stun the attacker for multiple moments, before another hit to the rifle's butt, this time against his forehead, sent him flying into the ground with a dull thud, where he then remained laying, writhing in pain, and pressing his hands against his face in agony. Well, at least he was still conscious. More Miet guards then started to quickly dispatch more of the charging attackers in similar fashions. Many laid one of the apparent amateurs out in hand-to-hand, proving their cat-like reflexes as they moved blindly fast while attacking vital, or at least extremely painful areas. Though some others, as soon as they were in range, quickly pulled less lethal alternatives to their current weaponry out of their belts or pockets, and sent the attackers to the ground with quick discharges of electricity, or douses of chemical deterrents instead. James had of course been acquainted with similar stopping weapons in the past himself. However, with these ones being Deathworlder grade, and seeing the reactions that the Miet showed when being hit by them, the feeling crept up on him that he may not have the same luck again should he try to go up against these ones as well. The encounter was over almost as quickly as it began, and despite still being quite baffled at the way the Miet forces had chosen to handle the altercation, James had to admit that he was not just slightly impressed at the speed they had dispatched of the aggressors with. Although, even if they were confident in their abilities to do so, had they been his subordinates, he would still certainly have scolded them for taking such an unnecessary risk. Meanwhile, most likely correctly assuming that the human soldiers weren't going to shoot incapacitated people on the floor, the rest of the feline guards stepped out of their way again, while also aiming to keep moving now that the danger had presumably passed. "The hell was that about?" Edmund mumbled, and Tia grumpily concurred with that question as she looked at the painfully writhing people on the ground. James also had a very similar question on his mind. If he hadn't known better, he would have almost assumed the whole thing was staged. "Animals," Quaffin commented with a shake of his head, while his guards began to return to their previous positions to reform their formation. James scoffed at him while looking at the pitiful figures with empathy. He wasn't beyond sympathizing with them. After all, he himself had been driven to desperation before, and that more than once. For lack of a better term, he couldn't deny these people their humanity. However, he had to admit that it was concerning. If these people were willing to charge and attack armed guards without much regard for their own safety, well, he could only hope that they had reacted that way mostly because they had possibly recognized Quaffem. He wasn't sure how likely that was, but he didn't exactly like the thought of considering the other options. "That was pretty risky," he commented, figuring that starting a fight with Quaffem right then and there would benefit nobody. Quaffem released a hissing breath through his teeth and both his ears, and his pale eyes twitched over towards James. "It's bad press to shoot someone," Noidjavar explained in his boss's stead, keeping a much calmer facade up than the White Lion did. His silver clothing glistened in the mid-light with each of his movements, as he didn't even spare a glance at the defeated adversaries. "We like to avoid it as much as possible. Besides, the sound of shots would have just summoned more of them to our position." "That's what they're paid for," Quaffin roughly added, most likely smelling another question coming and wanting to answer it before it was even asked, and handsomely so. For a species that seemed as self-preserving as the Miet were, that seemed to be rather backwards. Or maybe it was that way especially since they were so self-preserving. James didn't exactly have time to ponder that, but it was an interesting conundrum to be sure. In the end, he decided to just keep moving. "Those guys aren't bad," Sheeda passively commented, as he started to walk beside her again, having seemingly paid close attention to the guards as they handled the aggressors. "I think we should all just be glad to be on each other's side right now." Well, animosity and disagreements aside, James still thought that he could possibly agree to that. It was in most cases that he would much rather have an ally than a foe, even if not seen entirely eye to eye with them. Luckily, the description of the bunker being just a few blocks down from Quaffem's office building was rather apt, and they therefore managed to arrive at their destination before any more mishaps could happen. Despite never feeling truly in danger, James still breathed a bit lighter when the heavy doors of the fortified building with thick metal walls came into view. Apparently somehow keeping tabs on the group's advancement towards them directly, the on-site staff already opened the door for them before they had even fully reached it, allowing the escorted group to just walk inside without slowing down. Though admittedly, it did seem like some of the felines guarding the place had half a mind to stop the masked and heavily armed strangers as they made their way into the building. If James had to guess, it was mostly the completely indifferent presence of Kwaf Wen that convinced them otherwise. After all, could more firepower on your side ever truly hurt? The heavy door closed loudly behind them once even the last person of the group had entered, leaving them suddenly engulfed by the oppressing silence caused by the heavily reinforced walls. Meanwhile, Kwaf Wen was almost immediately approached by one of the on-site guards. Judging by their well-groomed appearance as well as the quality of the brownish uniform they were wearing, James assumed them to be rather high-ranking among the people here. The two mutually spoke to each other, and although James of course wished to know what was going on, there was absolutely no chance he would catch even a hint of their conversations, as the felines leaned into each other with their ears curving downwards, almost forming their own little chamber for the sounds of their voices. Although what did not escape James was that when the both of them suddenly and simultaneously turned, throwing very telling glances over at him, Kwaf Wen once again appeared to be judging or scrutinizing him with a look that reminded James of a drill sergeant, trying to decide if you were fit for your service. The guard's look, however, was a bit wide-eyed, and James could have sworn that he saw some of the colour drain from the feline's face, although it was hard to tell under their tan skin. He wondered what could elicit such a reaction to the sight of him from the soldier. Suddenly, James felt someone tap onto his shoulder. Turning his head, he saw the projected face of Andres' filter, not too far from his own. "Let's take a step aside," the Major proposed, and thumbed towards an unpopulated corner of the room with his right hand. "I still don't like the look of this." James nodded understandingly. After that earlier display of the felines, and especially after they had stepped into their line of fire so willingly, he could relate to the feelings of his former superior. If they could stay amongst themselves and keep an eye on everyone else, it was probably the wise choice to do that. While moving towards the corner, he also watched as Kwaf Wen was ushered away as well, likely to discuss whatever matters needed discussing in the privacy of a separate room. At the same time, another of the on-site guards approached his workers, most likely informing them of the options they had to spend their time, now that they would most likely be locked in here until the time the situation was resolved. He would probably have Sheeda translate it for him later. Right now, he slumped against the wall with a groan, and allowed himself to slowly slip down the smooth surface until his rear end landed squarely in the rounded edge at its base. Pulling a handkerchief out of the breast pocket of his suit, he wiped away a bit of sweat around his neck, and almost wished that he could take his breath filter off to do the same around his forehead. Around him, the soldiers began to briefly discuss the earlier encounter and the thoughts that had gone through their head during it. Apparently, not just a few of them had played with the thought of possibly having to fire at not just the assailants. Meanwhile, Sheeda plopped herself down beside him, wrapping her arms around her knees and twiddling her thumbs as she stared forwards. "You okay?" she asked after a few seconds, having most likely noticed James once again staring at the frightful-looking Miat that slowly left the room as they were guided away to separate areas of the bunker. "Holding up fine," James replied with a smile and leaned over, putting the side of his head atop the top of hers, while leaning against her. Their memories were unpleasant, but, well, he had to deal with them. She'd hummed in agreement. Then her tone suddenly shifted as she asked, "So, are you going to call them?" James lifted his head again to look at her confusedly. She sounded rather casual about the question, but she had also whispered it quite quietly, as if not wanting to draw attention with it. "Call who?" he whispered back, trying to be as quiet as the feline was, although the amplifier still in his voice caused it to fail quite horribly. Sheeda smacked her lips at his apparent thickness. "A Fezalon, of course," she hissed back at him, barely audible. James lifted his eyebrows at her. Admittedly, he hadn't quite considered doing that, at least not yet. After all, the mysterious person tended to react quite allergically to any sort of accusation made against them. Presumably calling them to ask if they planned a riot on Sankantiot Station today wasn't exactly going to get a positive answer out of them. "I don't know," he replied, and feeling like his angle of thought might not sound all too convincing outwardly, he added, "Wouldn't want to make myself suspicious by calling a shady individual in a situation like this." Despite his best efforts, Sheeda looked at him unconvinced. And not just she did. Apparently he had by far not been quiet enough to not be heard by every single one of the soldiers surrounding the two of them, and therefore whole 8 projected faces of dubious scrutiny were now glowing back at him with unimpressed expressions. He didn't need any words added to that. Loudly, and maybe a bit exaggeratedly, he let out a long sigh before clearing his throat. "I guess a courtesy call can't hurt," he mumbled, while pulling his phone out of his pocket. After calling what was possibly the strangest contact he had saved in the device, it didn't even take one entire ring cycle before the call was picked up. "Hello, James," a Veselon's bright yet unmoving voice said. "Hey," James said, deliberately avoiding it to say their name, just in case someone might be listening in unwantedly. "Crazy question, but have you by chance heard what is happening on Sankantiot Station?"